Okay, so now we have both of our exterior parts with our piping on, if you've chosen to put the piping on. If you're not using the piping, it's absolutely fine. I'm just going to make, just notice there's a slight bump in there, so I'm just going to make another small cut into my seam allowance on my piping, which just, let's release that, that's what I wanted, that's fine. So now we're going to add our gusset. So this is my gusset with my snaps already put on, and I've got one of my exterior panels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay my exterior panel right sides together with my gusset panel, and I've marked the centre of my gusset on both sides, and I already have that centre mark on my exterior panel that I created before. So I'm just going to match up those centre marks, and I'm going to clip those centre marks and then along the bottom edge. And I'm just going to carefully go all the way around the outside, clipping as I go. Now what you must make sure you don't do is push any of these little bits of the piping so that they're facing the piping. They need to be all out towards the outside edge. It's very easy to catch them sometimes, certainly if your piping's not made of very thick faux leather, which often if you've bought it, if you've actually been to the shop and bought some, it isn't. It's made of quite thin faux leather, so those little sort of tassely bits that are on the insides can sometimes get pushed in as you do this. So you're matching up all of those raw edges and clipping. Don't worry if it doesn't sit as smooth as you might like around that curve. That's because we haven't actually done any of the clipping that we need to do as yet. So you're coming up and over the top of that 90-degree angle that we made at the top of our piping. So that's one side on. I'm going to do exactly the same on the other curve. Again, trying to make sure that my piping, the sort of tassely edges of my piping stay out towards the outside edge of the bag. You can trim them off with a pair of sharp scissors if they get caught, but it's not ideal. It's easier to just make sure that they're facing in the right direction at this point than it is to do that afterwards. And just continue to clip all the way up, and there we have our gusset is now clipped into place all the way around the outside. Now you can stitch this from either side. If you want to follow the original stitch line, then turn it over so that you're stitching on the back of the exterior panel, and you can actually follow the stitch line that you already made when you put your piping on. I find it's easier for me to stitch from this side, so I'm not following that line of piping, that line of stitching I've already made. And again, you're going to use a zipper foot or a piping foot to go, you can feel it even through the foam, you can feel where the piping is, and you're going to be using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You're going to start your stitching 1/4 inch away from the top of the gusset. Let's just move that forwards because it's not, I keep moving it back so that I can work in that space. So you're going to start your stitching 1/4 inch away from the top edge of the gusset, and you're going to just do couple of back stitches. And you're going to have to go slowly when you go over that bit where you've got that 90-degree angle. Now I'm going to use my finger to feel where my piping is. And I'm going to run my foot down the side of the piping, making sure that all my edges stay close together. Now I am doing this from what would appear to be the wrong side, and that's because this piping foot actually is, this foot is actually, the needle goes in on the wrong side. However, I don't need my seam allowance marks on my needle plate because I'm actually using the piping that I've already attached as my guide for where I'm actually stitching. So it's fine for me to be doing it from this side. If you prefer to do it from the other side, you can use an adjustable zipper foot, and you actually don't need a Teflon one at this point because you're not stitching on the faux leather. I have got a size 16 needle in here, which is appropriate for the amount of layers I'm going through and the foam, and it works fine. Now, I very often like to stitch from the centre and then stitch out from the centre. On this occasion I haven't done, don't ask me why. I just completely didn't. And I start at the bottom of the centre and stitch out on both sides just to make sure that any stretch is equal on both sides. When you get to these curves, make sure that you push everything down so that it's as flat as it can be. And take it nice and slowly. Literally, you can literally go almost one stitch at a time. Just push the excess fabric out of the way, but make sure you don't push it away from the seam allowance on the side so that your raw edges stay matched. It's actually easier for you to see what I'm doing when I do it from this side too, which is useful. So I can use my finger to feel where the piping cord is underneath there, because I want to be stitching as close to the piping cord as I can. Now some people will tell you it's easier to put the piping cord on the gusset. And for application purposes it is, however the finished effect often isn't, because the curves don't sit as nicely when you've done it on a straight edge like that. I find it's a lot nicer finish if you actually apply the piping to the curves. It is, however, a personal preference, and if you decide you want to put the piping, we're not going around the corner yet, put the piping on the gusset and then fit the gusset to the exterior panels, then please feel free to. I just don't think it gives as good a finish at the end. So again, you're just kind of manipulating the gusset fabric as you go around these curves so that you don't get any puckers. Just taking off one clip at a time, going forward a few stitches, feeling for where that piping cord is underneath the layers. So using my finger to feel. If you are worried about being able to feel the piping cord through thick layers of foam, then you can always mark your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance onto your gusset before you actually stitch it on. That's easy enough to do, and then you've got a line to follow. it rather depends on how confident you are that you can actually stitch an accurate 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And it does have to be accurate so that you can, your two panels are both very close to your piping. So I'm going to come up to the other end here and I'm going to stop my stitching a 1/4 inch from the end of my gusset panel. Let's just remove that. Let's just get rid of the clips before I end up with them all over the floor, which is what normally happens. And let's just find what I need. So we now have a gusset fitted onto our exterior panel. Now our piping is sitting nicely in the middle there. What we need to do to make sure that the piping is sitting where we want it to be is turn it through the right way. Now this won't sit perfectly because we've still got all of this foam and what have you in those curves, but it will give us an idea of how things are sitting. And actually that looks really great. However, there are occasions where if you don't get close enough to the piping, I can't even show you because I haven't actually done it, that you'll get almost a gap here between the piping and the main exterior panel, where you can see the stitches where you actually stitched your piping onto the exterior panel. If you're close enough, if you stitch close enough, you shouldn't have that. You should just have a really nice line of piping that goes all the way around the outside of your panel. And mine actually has come out really nicely, so I don't actually need to correct it. If you find you do have that gap, all you need to do is go back in, turn it around the right way, and just stitch just a little bit closer, just a little bit further in. Now if I turn this over, you should be able to see, even though I didn't stitch on top of my stitching, I have actually stitched pretty much on top of my stitching, even though I was stitching from the other side, which is how I want it to be. So having done this, now we're going to remove the foam from the seam allowance. Now I do use a craft knife to remove my basting stitches, and I'm going to remove my basting stitches from about the point where this bit of piping sticks out, not above, because I still want the foam in the top part. And I'm just going to use my craft knife between the layers and just remove those basting stitches. And I know I should be using a seam ripper, but I'm just much more comfortable with a craft knife than I am with a seam ripper. So as long as you're careful, you can use whatever you want, really, whatever suits you best. I've stabbed myself too many times with a seam ripper, and I rarely ever stab myself with one of these. Now I've said it, I'm going to do it, and I'll probably bleed all over the place. And you may actually get to hear swearing. But so far so good. Just removing all of this, all of these basting stitches. And this is why I tell you to do, if you're not used to basting, or if this is something that's sort of quite new to you, to baste stitch in a different colour, because then you know that you're removing the correct stitches. If you do choose to use a craft knife, be careful, make sure that you have absolute control over it and that you don't actually cut through any of your construction stitches, because then you will be very unhappy. So that's the basting stitches removed from the exterior panel, and I'm now going to remove the basting stitches from the gusset. You do have to go slowly as you go around those curves, but you can see that when I do the straight edges, I can literally just kind of skim along and it takes them out quite quickly. You do need a very sharp blade in there though. You can't do it with a blunt blade. Blunt blades just drag and that doesn't work. And I actually don't tend to do this. I tend to use a seam ripper if I'm using fabric for the exterior, because I'm always a bit concerned that the knife might cut into my fabric. It doesn't tend to cut into faux leather. Personal preference, and it's also because I don't actually have a seam ripper handy. I probably have, but I just can't be bothered to look for one. So there we are. We've now removed all of that basting stitches from the seam allowances, and now I'm going to remove the foam from the seam allowance on both sides. Now for the gusset, you're going to be removing the foam all the way to the top, and I like to literally double trim, so go back in and trim off any little bits that are left, because any foam left in the seams will just mean that the bag doesn't sit quite as nicely on the sides, and your piping won't sit nice as smoothly as it should do. So all this stuff that's done inside of the bag is the stuff that gives the final finished bag a really professional finish. And you can see that I actually have the blade of my scissors sort of sideways onto the fabric, which miters the edge of the foam, giving it a much cleaner finish at the end. It's effectively kind of like grading the seam, because you're mitering the foam as you go. Now, some people like to use big scissors, some people like to use small scissors, and I tend to swap and change. Sometimes I prefer a big scissor and sometimes I prefer smaller ones. It rather depends on how fussy the shape is that I'm trying to cut the foam from. It's definitely worth going back and just taking off any excess that you've got. Just even those little slithers will make a huge difference. So that's the foam removed from the gusset side. From the main exterior panel, you're going to be removing the foam from approximately halfway between the sort of top of your gusset and where that piping comes out. So not right up to the top. You will be taking the foam right out afterwards, but not at this point. Again, I've heard people say, oh, that's wasteful, but it is just a fraction of an inch. If you're new to bag making and you haven't used a foam stabilizer before, and you're not sure your machine can cope with stitching through all the foam, I do have a video in my YouTube library showing you how to thin down the sides of the foam before you start sewing, and I'll add that into the sew along group, and if you're watching these videos after the sew along is completed, then you can find that in my video library on YouTube. Look for Bags by Bags of Style. So there we have all of the foam trimmed away from inside, and you can see there that I've just literally, there's the gusset starting a quarter of an inch, stitching starting a quarter of an inch down, and the foam is cut away to a point that's just halfway between where that piping is and the top of the gusset. Now we're going to trim out some of this seam allowance around the bottom. We're going to make little triangular cuts. Now if you have pinking shears, you can use those. I still like to use my scissors. So why do we do this? Well, basically because we've made a curve and we've got several layers of fabric here, including our piping. When we turn this bag in the right way, all of this fabric from, let me just do it and show you. All of this fabric inside of the bag creates this sort of rather unsightly, unpleasant, puckered look. And actually what you want is to have enough space for that fabric to sit nicely inside of that curve. So I'm going to continue to just trim out the cut triangles out from this curve, and then I'll turn it right way out so you can kind of see what I mean. It helps the curves to sit nicely inside of the bag so that the curve will look nice on the outside of the bag. So you can see there that I've cut little triangular notches out from around the curve. So that one you can see is quite puckered. It looks a bit like it looks like there's too much fabric in that curve. This one that I've trimmed out sits much nicer. The triangles, the gaps that I've made allow that fabric to sit more evenly inside of that curve. It also allows for the curve on the outside to sit nicely. So I'm just going to go in and trim the other one out. There's lots of turning backwards and forwards with this. And it's always worth double checking every time you stitch when you're using piping, because if your piping is just a little way away from the edge, or your stitching's just a little way away from the piping, you will end up with the piping sitting almost slightly proud of the curves that you're going round, which just doesn't look right. Piping should be flush to the side of your bag. It should be right on that seam, not sort of sitting a little way out from the seam. You will also often get to see the stitching that you did to create your piping in the first place, which is why some people like to use double-sided tape. And I've already explained why I don't like to use double-sided tape. Again, personal preference. So there we go. Again, I've just taken all those little triangles out. Just again, turn it round the right way, just to get an idea of how that looks. Push it out with your fingers, roll that seam to make sure that your piping is sitting perfectly on the side of your bag, and that's what you want. You want the piping to sit perfectly between those two layers, and I think that does. I really like it, and actually my piping's kind of pink opposed to the I obviously didn't get the pink on this panel, so it actually shows up quite nicely, which I'm quite happy with. So we've done one, turn it back out so that it's wrong side out, and we're then going to take the second side and we're going to do the same thing again with our side panel so that it's facing right sides together with the other one. Find that centre mark, match it up with the centre mark on your gusset, and clip it in place. And the second side goes in exactly the same way as the first side does. Again, you're watching to make sure none of those little bits of that you've got on the side of your piping get caught facing inwards. They all need to be facing that outside edge. You're easing those curves in. Using as many clips as you feel you need. I actually think that with curves you need as many clips as you can fit in, to be honest. I'm a great one for not using as many clips as I perhaps ought to, but around a curve it's worth using plenty of clips just to make sure everything stays where it's supposed to. That's one side. Let me just move this back a little bit so you can see a bit more what I'm doing. actually considered that this is quite a big bag and I have a very limited amount of space here. So I have to keep moving that camera backwards and forwards, so I do apologise. And we'll just continue to clip all the way around in exactly the same way as we did with that first side. And then I'm going to stitch all the way around the outside exactly the same way as I did with the first side. Now the one thing that I forgot to mention is that you can at this point trim off any excess bits of piping that's sitting out in your seam allowance. You shouldn't have too much. Oops, I'll just flick that off the table. You shouldn't have too much there, but if you have a little bit sticking out, then just take it off now because you don't need it. So I'm going to carry on and stitch this side in place, and I will do exactly the same thing again. I'll turn it the right way, turn the bag right side out, double check all of the curves for my piping to make sure that my stitching is close enough to where I need it to be, and then I can trim away, remove the basting stitches and trim away the foam. Again, we trim away the foam from approximately halfway between the top of our piping cord and where the gusset, top of the gusset sits. All this foam at the top of the bag needs to stay where it is. So I'm going to leave you because I don't think you need to see the same thing over and over again, and we'll come back and we'll start looking at how we construct our lining.